When I open up my scripture text for the week and I read it and I think, okay, I kind of understand what's going on here, but I often wish that they talked about something that I knew a little better without having to research. Like, for example, there's nothing in the Bible about Major League Baseball. There's nothing in there about video games from my childhood, things that I just know and understand. Instead, there's often very agrarian, rural, gardening, farming texts. And I don't know anything about that stuff. And so sometimes I read these scriptures and I really want to make them come alive, and I really want to understand the world that Jesus or the prophets lived in and how they make these passing metaphors. And I can vaguely understand what they're talking about, but just as soon as I begin to play out the implications of these things, I get lost because I've never pruned a vineyard before. I've never grown corn. I've never raised lamb for slaughter. These sort of things happen in the scriptures all the time from a yester world, and I have to spend a lot of time trying to understand, but every once in a while I try to understand it and something comes along that comes out of it. It's actually pretty helpful, and my hope is this week that that's exactly the sort of thing that has happened. Because we're talking today about the very last I am statement that Jesus says in the Gospel of John. It's found in chapter 15. We're going to read verses 1 through 17 today. And in this particular text, Jesus is talking about a vineyard, a vine, growing and harvesting grapes, which is something I've never done before. I know that they kind of grow well in California and France, and that oftentimes they're used to grow in order to make wine. I remember the episode of I Love Lucy that my parents made me watch when I was a kid, where Lucy stepped on the grapes. I don't know if that's how they made wine. I know that now people make grape juice, which is only like a 100-year-old invention. In fact, Welch's was the first one to make grape juice, and they made it for communion so that there would be no fermented grape juice for people who weren't safe around alcohol. So if you want to know what brand of grape juice to buy, that's a pretty good place to start. That's where grape juice came from, actually. I like the taste of grapes, and that's about the end of what I know about grapes. And so reading this text, I thought, oh man, I'd really better dig in a little bit. I'm not very good at growing things either. We have a garden and some things grow okay, but I don't really know what's going to grow good or not good because I don't really know. I just put things in the ground and I water it, and usually things sprout up, and usually they taste like what it says they're supposed to when they go in the ground. I was really proud of myself this year because I have a husky dog, and my dog likes to dig holes, and when winter was over, we had a big patch of just dirt and holes in our front yard, and I thought, I'm gonna patch this and make grass where grass belongs again. And we have grass where there used to be dog holes. And that's about as good as I get when it comes to tending the ground. And frankly, it was kind of hit and miss as to whether or not we were gonna have grass for a while. And so I'm pretty happy that I can at least use a patch of grass seed that I got at Home Depot and make grass appear. Yeah. So we're going to talk a little bit about harvesting and planting today. And I want you to know that I started out not knowing anything. And so I'm kind of excited about what I learned, and I hope it helps you as well. So we're going to read about this different world that we don't live in, but a text, I think, at the same time that's pretty familiar. And sometimes when you don't know the world the text is written in and you know the text itself, sometimes it's really easy to just kind of enter into autopilot and miss some of the real richness that's there. And so we're going to read again from John chapter 15, and we're going to start with verse 1 to 17. And I invite you to join me in standing as we read the word of the Lord today. John chapter 15, verse 1. I am the true vine, and my Father is the gardener. He cuts off every branch in me that bears no fruit, while every branch that does bear fruit he prunes, so that it will become even more fruitful. You are already clean because of the word I have spoken to you. Remain in me as I also remain in you. No branch can bear fruit by itself. It must remain in the vine. Neither can you bear fruit unless you remain in me. I am the vine, you are the branches. If you remain in me and I in you, you will bear much fruit. Apart from me, you can do nothing. If you do not remain in me, you are like a branch that is thrown away and withers. Such branches are picked up and thrown into the fire and burned. If you remain in me and my words remain in you, ask whatever you wish and it will be done for you. This is to my Father's glory, that you bear much fruit, showing yourselves to be my disciples. As the Father has loved me, so have I loved you. Now, remain in my love. If you keep my commands, you will remain in my love. And just as I have kept my Father's commands and remain in his love. I have told you this so that my joy may be in you and your joy may be complete. My command is this: love each other as I have loved you. Greater love has no one than this, to lay down one's life for one's own friends. You are my friends if you do what I command. I no longer call you servants, because a servant does not know his master's business. Instead, I have called you friends, for everything that I learned from my Father I have made known to you. You did not choose me, but I chose you and appointed you, so that you might go and bear fruit, fruit that will last. And so whatever you ask in my name, the Father will give you. This is my command: love one another. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. You may be seated. So, I didn't know much about grapevines or tending grapevines. I know how to eat grapes. I know how to clean grapes. I know which kind of grapes I like. But I didn't really know how they went about being made. Last year, we put some watermelon seed in the garden, and vines are crazy. They go everywhere. And we did end up like little green fruit that vaguely were like watermelon, so that's kind of cool. But tending to vines is difficult because they grow rapidly and they grow out of control. And what I didn't know about grapevines at all is how you get the grapes to grow, right? Like, is that just natural? Does it just happen? But it appears that when you start having vines, there's a lot of fruit that wants to break through and have life. This is what shocks me. It's not just like every 5 feet there's a bushel of grapes. The farmer actually needs to go to a grapevine and inspect the early fruit that is growing, because a grapevine can grow a lot of grapes. But you cannot have good grapes if you just simply let them all grow. The farmer must look at the vine and begin the process of what we call pruning. I think we all know what pruning is. It's just carefully cutting things that are extraneous or unnecessary or too much. So a farmer might go and look and see a place that will produce grapes, but doesn't like the early fruit that it's seeing and believes that this bad fruit will probably steal the resources of the better fruit. And so a farmer who works in a vineyard works through their vine and begins seeing things that will produce fruit, but decides that the fruit will be mediocre. And so it cuts off what's going to make passable fruit, decent grapes, to make sure the grapes that are very good are the ones that thrive and survive. And so this fruit, you've had grapes that aren't your favorite before, right? You've eaten it and thought, well, yeah, it tastes like a grape, but it's not great. It's not the best grape I've ever had. Farmers go out of their way to take fruit that is perfectly viable and perfectly lively and choose which one is going to become fruit, but not the best fruit, in order to make sure the absolute best fruit thrives. And so they want to look like a bushel like this at the end. But there's a lot of decent grapes that get cut very early in the process to make sure that only the best and juiciest and reddest thrive. In this text, Jesus says that his Father is the farmer. the gardener. He looks upon the fruit that's being born out of his people. Jesus says, I am the vine, you are the branches. Now, we more or less understand how that works, right? The branches come into the vine. The vine is like the artery, the life of the fruit-bearing plant, right? It takes the nutrients from the ground and sends it to the entire vine or tree or bush or whatever it is you're growing. And so the center of the vine nourishes out so that fruit can be born. But he says the gardener comes by and prunes. And I don't know about you, but pruning stinks. Like, even if you're a plant, right, you don't want sharp things around cutting parts of you off. It's no good. We've had in our life before moments where we have felt pruned by God, where things that felt good and were enjoyable and things we liked were suddenly taken from us. As a child, I moved a lot. My dad was in the military and was constant battle with God in our family. Why won't you let us grow roots here? Things would change and move, and God was always good through it all. But when change comes, when things happen, when God removes or moves or changes something in our life, our pattern, our autopilot is to shake our fist at God and say, I liked that. Why did you do that to me? That fruit was good. And the thing about pruning a grapevine is that, the fruit will come if you don't prune it. The fruit will come. It will be fruit. It will be obviously a grape, but it's not the best grape that the vine can produce. And so here Jesus is saying that there are times and moments in our life that God is trying to cultivate the best fruit out of us, the best flourishing, the best way of life, the best possible fruit that we can produce as a gift back to God. And sometimes things that are just good or mediocre or are taking resources from the best of us, sometimes God comes along and prunes it off. We don't always know the reason. The gardener doesn't explain the reason to the grapes that are thriving. But if God is the gardener and God is pruning in our life, it does not mean that he's punishing us. It may simply mean that there's something better that can grow out of our life already. The gardener is the one in control. In this metaphor here, as branches, that can often feel like a place of just lawlessness, of complete and utter submission to things and beings and spirits beyond our capacity. We so often want agency that's better than being a branch. But yet that's where we are here in the metaphor. God is a gardener who is cultivating through Jesus a people that bears fruit, and our job is to remain connected to the life force given to us through the vine that is planted and rooted in God's good creation. Jesus is the one who gives us life, and God comes through working us, molding us, that we might bear incredibly juicy fruit. Now, there's something interesting about a grapevine if you think about it, and I'm going to kind of give this a little bit of agency that it doesn't have, but just follow with me for a moment if you would. This grapevine, if you were to find this in the wild, never once thinks to itself, I wish I was a cow. It never once thinks, I would like to ride on an airplane. It never once wonders what it's like to dunk a basketball. The grapevine knows its purpose with unbelievable clarity. Its job is to produce grapes. It is judged on whether or not it is a good grapevine based on how good the grapes are that it is producing. This is the only thing that a grapevine is meant to do, and is the only thing the grapevine is concerned with doing. It never once asks to be something that it isn't, and gives its entire self, every bit of resource it gets and gives, in order to creating the most beautiful, flavorful grapes for whatever purpose they will eventually have. The grapevine knows its purpose is to be a grapevine and to produce grapes as fruit. Now, if we extend this metaphor out just a little bit, how often do we have that sort of intense clarity as to what it is we are meant to be as a creation? In our very capable minds, in our incredible agency that God has given us, we find ourselves so deeply confused so often about who it is we are meant to be and what it is we are meant to do. But this is maybe why Jesus' metaphor here is so incredibly helpful. Jesus tells us our role, our God-given job, our purpose is to remain deeply connected to the vine. We have been created for a purpose, and that purpose is to be connected with Jesus and therefore with God himself. And that when we do that, out of that bears fruit. So we're not trying to figure out all the time, am I a banana tree or am I a coconut tree, right? The fruit itself tells us who we are. We begin by connecting ourselves to Jesus. And when we do that, we begin to find what it is that God is cultivating out of our lives. We don't take what we want to do and bring it to Jesus. We start with Jesus and find what it is that Jesus is doing through our life. The fruit we bear, we all bear fruit in our life. People who encounter us can tell us what kind of fruit we taste like when they experience us. Some of us are deeply bitter fruit. Some of us are spoiled fruit. Some of us are sweet and delicious and exactly the purpose and person that God has created us to be. We only get to being a sweet, delicious fruit by remaining in Jesus, by receiving our life from him, by knowing his heart and his life. And when we're connected, we become a person that God has intended and called us to be. Now, this metaphor carries on in all sorts of ways, right? There's some terrifying parts that if we choose to just not become a branch anymore, we become chaff along the ground, swept up and thrown into a fire. That life comes by being connected to the vine. That death comes by separating ourselves from the vine. There's other ideas about the pruning, which is also scary, right? Because when we subject ourselves to Jesus, Jesus may take and move things that we deeply love that are very good. They're not bad, they're fruit. And yet they're taking resources from our main purpose to build the best fruit of our lives. But yet, we can trust that when we fulfill our purpose of being connected to Jesus, trusting that Jesus will bear life and fruit out of our lives, we find that we meet our ultimate purpose and goal. It is an act of trust and relationship that's deeply important for us throughout the entirety of our life, to remain connected with Jesus and let him build the fruit and choose the fruit that comes out of our lives. And Jesus seems to think that we will live a purposeful, satisfying, full, robust, meaningful life if we will do just that. For him, in his metaphor, the grapes become grapes. Those that remain, like their purpose is fulfilled, and something beautiful comes of it. And so how do we live this out according to Jesus? Jesus explains to us that the way we live this out is to follow his commands. If we will follow his commands like he has followed the Father's commands, we will be exactly what he has intended for us to be. He will move us from servant to friend. We'll be an insider. We will know his business. This is his work. And so what are these commands? Show me that there's so many commands in the Bible. Which one should I follow? Point me in the way. And he says, love one another. And then weirdly, he says nothing else. Because I've read the Bible before, I'm sure you have too. I want this to be a pretty complex thing. Okay, Jesus, I'll get my paper out, I'll write this all down, and I'll start the checklist. I'll get it all right. And Jesus here says, this is my command for you. Love one another. Love one another as I have loved you. Surely there's got to be more to it than this, right? These are Jesus' final hours. These are his final words. If you track from like John 13 through John 17, this is Jesus' like discourse. I'm like his final words. I am leaving you. I am going. These are all the things you need to know. You're in charge now. I'm going to come back later. Keep the operation going. Okay, tell us all the important stuff, Jesus. Love one another. I always want it to be more complicated than that. Surely it has to be more complicated than that. And of course, there are other places in the Bible that give us some robustness, but sometimes we miss the utter simplicity of Jesus. Let's start here. God has loved us in such a profound way. He even says in this text, the greater love is to lay down your life for your friends. And he's about to do that for us, who he calls his friends in this text. His number one call, his number one fruit that we can bear is that we would be so embodied by his love that flows through the vine into the branches that are us, that the fruit we bear is a radical and incredible love for one another. For Jesus, he says, the world will know who I am because they're going to taste the fruit that you're producing connected to me. And we know that Jesus is love. The scriptures say God is love, not God is like love or God is loving. God is love. And so the fruit that the world should taste when they pick off of our vine ought to taste like this love that God is coursing through the veins of his vines. This whole series we've been talking about the I am statements, and this is the last one, I am the true vine. But each of them, all 7 of them, are incredible, and I'll remind you of what they are all in just one second, but we know that these I am statements are rooted in God's own naming of himself at the burning bush in Exodus. And so God reveals himself as one who liberates people from bondage. That's who God is. He hears his people, his covenant people, groaning in slavery, and God moves to free them from that which binds them. And he goes to Moses and asks Moses to be his leader, and Moses hears all this and thinks, how in the world am I going to go to Pharaoh, the most powerful man in the world, and just casually say, this God I met in a bush says you should let your slaves go. So Moses says, who should I tell him has sent me? Who is this God that is so powerful that he can coax Pharaoh into freeing his slaves? And God's answer is, tell him, I am has sent you. Now, the Gospel of John does a lot of things, but it's written around these I am statements, fleshing out for us who this God is that has been God since the beginning. The God that hung the stars in the sky and carved lakes and oceans out of the ground and raised mountains out of the earth, put fish in the sea and populated the dry land with animals. This God is now present in Jesus. When we wonder who I am is, we have wondered, is this a distant God? Is this a hard to understand God? Is this a demanding God? We've wondered these things as we've encountered the Old Testament. But here, Jesus is embodying this God. When we see Jesus, we see the God who has been there all along. And we're getting explained to us through these I am statements, the characters and the heart of God that has been there since the beginning. But it all culminates in an incredible way in the Gospel of John, a way I don't want us to miss before we exit and move on to our next series. As soon as Jesus is done with this big discourse in chapter 17, Jesus prays for his disciples and believers and everything in John chapter 17, and immediately they move to a garden. The other gospel is called the Garden of Gethsemane. John just says it's a garden in Kidron Valley. And I want to read that story to you because it brings all of these stories that we've wrestled with together to an incredible head. I'm just going to read 7 verses, and I'm going to start with verse 1 in chapter 18. The story goes like this. When he had finished praying, Jesus left with his disciples and crossed the Kidron Valley. On the other side, there was a garden, and he and his disciples went into it. Now Judas, who betrayed him, knew the place, because Jesus had often met there with his disciples. So Judas came to the garden, guiding a detachment of soldiers and some officials from the chief priests and the Pharisees. They were carrying torches, lanterns, and weapons. Jesus, knowing all that was going to happen to him, went out and asked them, "Who is it that you want?" "Jesus of Nazareth," they replied. Now I'm going to stop here. We all know this story, right? This is familiar stuff. Jesus of Nazareth, they replied. I am he, Jesus said. Now this is where I get upset right here. I'm going to get on my soapbox for you, okay? This is a terrible translation of the Greek. Just utterly awful and terrible. Sometimes we want things to make sense in the English, and so we do things that are really scandalous with what was originally written. All of these texts in the Gospel of John have been, I am the bread of life, I am the true vine, I am the sheep, or the shepherd of the sheep, right? And here, they translate it, I am he. That is not what the text says. The text simply says, I am. Who is it that you want? Jesus of Nazareth, they replied. I am, Jesus said. And Judas, the traitor, was standing there among them. When Jesus said, I am, they drew back and fell to the ground. Again, he asked them, who is it that you want? Jesus of Nazareth, they said. This is a profound and compelling moment. We've been told over and over who this I am is. And when Jesus names himself, I am, this incredible group of conspiring Jews and Romans, soldiers with weapons, Pharisees under the shroud of night, all coming to arrest Jesus in a moment Jesus has known was coming for his entire ministry. Jesus names himself as the same God who met Moses, who liberates people from their bondage, and he named himself that, and the soldiers and the Pharisees and the teachers of law fell backwards and down. The text isn't clear if it was like a rumble that they couldn't stand anymore, or if they just knelt before the revelation of a God. But at this moment, Jesus, with this sort of power, this sort of moment that causes the most powerful, terrifying people in the world to submit to him, could have done it our way. Our way is to roll up our sleeves and start a war. Who you want? You want to be on the side of your torches, or you want to be on the side of a God who makes you kneel before him? But they keep persisting. I'm looking for Jesus. I'm looking for Jesus. The darkness of this world will persist even through the presence of God. We know that. We've experienced that. But here, Jesus does the most incredible thing. With all of the power that he can possibly muster that knocks the powers of this world to their knees, Jesus doesn't fight. He submits. He gives his life over to these powers. Because, as he said in the text we read for ourselves today, the greatest of love is to lay down your life for your friends. So he does just that. He's named us his friends, and he lays down his life rather than fighting a cosmic battle that he himself could have won. He accepts the sentence of death that is unjust, but one marked for him from the beginning. He gives his life up that he might experience the fullness of what we experience, but conquer even the worst that this world can throw at him, death. He goes through incredible trauma, pain, agony on our behalf, that on the other side, submitting himself to the God who called him, he trusted that life would win. And on Easter Sunday morning, it most certainly did. This is the God that Jesus has revealed to us in these stories. He's revealed himself in multiple ways and in a lot of metaphors. He's told us that I am the bread of life in order that we might be filled and be satisfied. He says, I am the light of the world in order to bring light into dark places. He says, I am the door of the sheep because he welcomes us into an eternal rest. He says, I am the good shepherd because he leads us towards God's glory and his eternity. He says, I am the resurrection and the life because he has come to defeat death and also to teach us how to live. He says, I am the way, the truth, and the life, so as to counter the confusion and the lies of this world. And he says, I am the true vine, so as to help sustain us and to help our lives find meaning in this world. This is the heart of God as it has been from the very beginning. And this is the Jesus that I preach about, that I tell you about, that I yearn for you to know. Because the more I know Jesus, the more I read about Jesus, the more I come to understand Jesus, I say I could not possibly recommend Jesus more. The amount of grace and love and purpose and meaning and restoration and redemption and hope that just oozes out of his life and his stories are more than anything else this world possibly offers to us. The stories, the history, the movement of God is incredible at absolutely every turn. I couldn't recommend Jesus more. He lays down his life for us. Lays down his life for us. With all the power he has for his own self-defense and his own defense at trial, he lays down his life for us, that we would not be sentenced to death, that our life would not be final at our final breath, that we could participate in the life that he's trying to show us and give us from the absolute very beginning. Jesus lays down his life for us. So as we close out today and as we lean into singing a final song, it's a song of incredible blessing, I invite you once again to consider yourself, where you are at in terms of being in relationship with Jesus. Is he your friend? Have you given your life to him? Have you chosen to follow him? Because his gift is simply as easy as accepting he is who he says he is. Recognizing that our way of sin leads to death and his way leads to life and eternity. And so if you've not accepted Jesus as your Savior before, you can come and pray at this time, and your only prayer has to be, I want to know you. I want to follow you. I want to turn my back on the ways of this world and enter into following you, being your friend and having you be mine. That's a great way to start. From there, the church is here to help you with the next step. I invite you to take a serious look at where you are at. And if you're not following him, I couldn't recommend following him more. Would you join me in standing as we sing this final song?